And you see them here. Now, most of the time, muscle does not attach directly to bone. Muscle attaches to tendon. Tendon attaches to bone. Most of the time. Where you'll recall from the skeleton that ligaments attach bone to bone. Ligaments keep bones in alignment, so they're not flopping all over the place. Heat is also produced by skeletal muscle. Okay, we'll go through some of these on this picture very quickly. I think we see them later on, right? We do not see them later on. Yes, we do. Okay. Now, of course, all you're seeing is the major muscle groups. Notice the six-pack. Everybody has those there. They're just not as developed as some, and of course, they might be covered by a little bit of. Well, I was going to say.
Protective layer.
Tests aren't graded yet, right? Careful.
You should try the cake first.
Okay. We already talked about agonist, antagonist, synergism, origins, insertion. Okay. So you can see that happening here. And notice what with the flexion, when we have flexion, we're going to decrease the angle of the joint. Most of the time with flexion, we decrease the angle of the joint. So if you look at the angle of my elbow right here, the angle is 180 degrees. But as the muscle contracts, as it flexes, it's going to pull my lower arm up towards my upper arm, which is now going to cause this angle to decrease to 90 degrees, and even to 45 degrees. You see how that works? So you often see that when the muscle crosses a joint like this, with flexion, that it decreases a joint. And it would make sense that it crosses a joint, because if this muscle, in this case the bicep brachii muscle, if this muscle started up here and did not cross a joint and ended right here, what would happen? Nothing, because it can't shorten that bone. So it has to cross a joint and move on to something else. In this case, the tubercle of the radius. The diaphragm is unique. It has both skeletal and smooth muscle, which is why it's under voluntary and involuntary control. We don't have to think about breathing, but we do have the ability to alter our breathing, right? We can hold our breath. Breathe deeply. That's out. Breathe shallow. There's a dome-shaped muscle. The idea of being a dome-shaped muscle, and again, I'm going to oversimplify a little bit, but the idea of being a dome-shaped muscle is what happens is that muscle, like any other muscle, when it contracts, it's going to shorten, which is going to cause it to flatten, which means it's going to be going down. And this is how we breathe in. Because when that diaphragm contracts, it flattens, which is how it becomes shorter. That's going to change the air pressure inside of our lungs. It's going to make the air pressure on our lungs be less than the air pressure outside in the world, and air is going to go rushing in. And then the diaphragm is going to relax, and air is going to passively move out, carrying out those waste products of metabolism. You can see it there. The intercostal muscles. The intercostal muscles are absolutely delicious if you slow cook them and cover them in a barbecue sauce.
Oops.
When we eat ribs, what are we eating? We're not eating the bone, right? We're eating the meat, and that's what the meat is. The external intercostal muscles are going to elevate. Okay. The internal are going to depress. I guess we'll see that a little later on too. We've seen some of these movements already. Rotation, you know what rotation is, right? We're on an axis. Circumduction, we've talked about that. Abduction, adduction, we've talked about those. Extension and flexion, we've talked about those. It's important that you realize what is happening when you're stretching your leg out versus bending your leg like this. That this is actually flexion and this is extension. Flexion, extension. Each muscle cell is an elongated fiber. That's why it's called fiber. It can be up to 12 inches in length. Several muscle fibers are bundled together in what we call fascicle. And a bunch of fascicles are bundled together into what we call muscle. Inside of a muscle cell, inside of a muscle fiber, same thing as a muscle cell, there are these long tubes called myofibrils, bless you, that run the length of this elongated cell. Each one of these long tubes is made up of sections called sarcomeres. The sarcomere is the part that actually does the work of shortening. So much like these tables, from here to here, from here to here, from there to there, are all lined up in a row like this. This is how we find the myofibrils with the sarcomere from here to here as one contractile unit. The next sarcomere from there to there is the next contractile unit. Inside of these sarcomeres, often designated the Z lines, because it looks so as a Z-like pattern, we find two filaments, two types of filaments. We find myosin and actin filaments. Myosin and actin. Myosin is a thick filament. Actin are these filaments that slide across the myosin, or I should say fold. You can kind of think of like the actin as being anchored at the ends of the sarcomere, and the myosin in the middle. And the myosin grabs a hold of these fibers and pulls them more towards the center. Just like if I attached a steel girder to that wall and a steel one to this wall, and I pulled these steel girders together, that would cause these walls to come closer together. And that's what's going to happen here, from Z line to Z line. These filaments are going to get pulled closer to the center of the sarcomere. So this whole sarcomere is going to shorten. And that one's going to shorten, and that one's going to shorten. So the distance that these three tables take up is going to be shorter, which means the myofibril that is made up of these filaments is going to become shorter. And since the muscle fiber contains these myofibrils, the entire muscle fiber is going to become shorter. And because the muscle fibers are bundled together into fascicles, the entire fascicle is going to become shorter. And because the fascicles are all bundled together into the muscle is going to become shorter. This is called the sliding filament theory. So you can see you can see here, the smallest part that's coming out towards you is the myofibril. Notice how they are all bundled together inside of this muscle fiber. So muscle fiber is a long tube with a whole bunch of long tubes inside of it. And each of these long tubes, you can see these little bands here, each band, from band to band, represents one sarcomere, like one of these cables. So each of those little units shorten, causing this whole filament to shorten, causing the fiber to shorten. And since all the fibers are bundled together into fascicles, this next group here, they're going to shorten. And because the fascicles are all bundled together into this muscle, the whole muscle is going to shorten. Okay, so you can see sarcomeres here, from here to here, from Z line to Z line is a sarcomere. Notice how we have these thin filaments here, and we have the thick filaments in the middle. Look like they have little golf club heads on them. What has to happen is the cell has to allow for these little heads to attach onto this actin filament that are at the time covered up. So we need something to uncover those binding sites and allow these cross bridges to occur, allow these parts here to grab onto the filament and pull. And the thing that's going to cause that to happen, allow that to happen, is actually calcium. Calcium is going to remove the binding sites on these little filaments. That's going to cause the big filament to grab on, create these cross bridges, in other words, a handhold, and pull. And these are going to get pulled towards the center, and these are going to get pulled towards the center, which means Z line to Z line is going to get pulled shorter. You see that? You see how that works?
Yeah.
Yes, no, sort of, because I'm not hearing anything, and I'm seeing a lot of confused faces. We have this thick filament with these club-like heads that are going to attach to areas on the thin filament. So go up, grab it, and pull. And they're going to get pulled towards the center. Notice how the thin filament is anchored at the end of that sarcomere, at the Z line. Yes? Okay. So, all we have to do is we have to allow for that big, thick filament to grab on. It can't grab on right now because the place where it grabs onto is covered up. So we have to uncover it. And the way that we uncover it is with calcium. Calcium enters that cell, floods the inside of the cell. That's going to uncover those binding sites. That's what creates, allows for the cross-bridging. I'm going to use air quotes, cross-bridging. In other words, that's what's going to allow those big, thick myosin filaments in the middle to grab on and then pull towards the center this tiny little actin filament, the thin one. And they are going to get pulled closer to the center here. Since they are anchored here and here, that means these are going to get pulled closer together. The Z lines are then going to get pulled closer together, which means this part right here is going to get pulled closer together, which means this whole thing is going to shorten. And since these are all, this myofibril is all inside of the muscle fiber, and they're getting shortened, it's going to cause the muscle fiber to shorten. The cell, muscle cell is going to shorten. And muscle cells are all bundled up into fascicles. Notice how everything's going the same direction. So everything is shortening in the same direction. All the fascicles are going to shorten, therefore all the muscle itself is going to shorten. This you might have to read over once or twice. Okay. You see the myosin heads on the big, thick filament? Notice how it's pulling the actin this way, and this one this way, so that they become closer together. If this is getting pulled this way, this is getting pulled this way, they're getting pulled closer together, and since this is anchored here, and this one's anchored here, that means this and this are going to get pulled closer together. Following? Got it? I know you do. I can tell. I don't know. All right. Interestingly, and what might be a little confusing is ATP is required for a muscle contraction. And you're going to say, well, that makes sense. But it really comes into play in the relaxation part, believe it or not. We'll see that a little bit later on. Calcium is stored in something called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It explains it in your book, I think is 2 Blake sacks or something. I think of it this way. I think of it as storage closets or storage containers that are inside the muscle cell. So already inside the muscle cell, we have a storage container full of calcium. All we have to do is let the calcium out of the container. When the calcium comes out of the container, it's going to fill up the muscle cell. That is what's going to uncover those binding sites and allow for that contraction to occur. And then it will return to the sarcoplasmic reticulum and relax. So, how does a muscle know when to contract? It's got to get a signal from someplace. Nervous system. A nerve is going to tell a muscle to contract. So here's what happens. We have, okay. Here's what happens. We have a signal that comes down the nerve in the form of an electrical current. This is called an action potential. Electrical current, plus and minus signs, just like a battery. So that signal, that message coming down as an electrical current gets to the very end of the neuron, this right here, called the bouton, terminal neuron, terminal bouton. When it gets to the end, just as it gets to the end, that signal, that electrical current, that action potential coming down here, that triggers calcium channels to open up. Calcium comes into the neuron. That electrical current then gets changed into a chemical released across this space, the neuromuscular junction. The name of that chemical is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is what gets released across the neuromuscular junction. Acetylcholine binds to receptors on the muscle fiber. Binding to the receptors opens the receptor, allows sodium to come in. Sodium comes in, depolarizes the cell. That is going to travel along the cell until it gets to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. When that signal gets to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it is going to open up, allow for calcium to be released within the cell, and then we have the filaments sliding across one another. So listen to this again, because this is important physiology. This action potential, the signal, travels down the neuron. As it approaches the very end of the neuron here, it opens up calcium channels in the membrane of the neuron. Calcium flows into the neuron. That is going to cause that signal that was an electrical signal to be released in the form of a chemical. And the chemical is called acetylcholine. So right now you just heard about calcium. I told you calcium is important in muscle contraction. So the more muscle that you have, the more calcium your body's going to have to need. It's going to have on hand. The more muscle you have, the more calcium your body's going to have to store. And where do we store our calcium? In our bones. So the more calcium we store in our bones, what happens? Stronger the bones. So if we want strong bones, we're going to have more muscle mass. In that way, the body will say, since we have all this muscle, we're going to have calcium for backup. We're going to have it around. Let's store it in some place convenient. That's the bones. So we've heard about calcium right there. As the signal comes down in the form of an action potential, electrical current, as it gets to the bottom here, it opens up calcium channels. Calcium comes into the neuron, not the muscle, we're going into the neuron. The calcium in the muscle is going to allow the release of the chemical. So we have an electrical signal, an electrical message that is going to cross this space as a chemical message. The neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Acetylcholine crosses this space, binds to receptors on the muscle fiber. As acetylcholine binds to receptors on the muscle fiber, it causes sodium channels to open up. Sodium comes into the muscle cell, depolarizes the muscle cell. That's going to eventually cause that sarcoplasmic reticulum to open up and allow calcium to be released within the muscle fiber itself. It's already in here, but it's in storage. When we release the calcium, that's going to uncover the binding sites. Now we're going to have the filaments slide together. We additionally have a guy who sits in here called acetylcholinesterase or cholinesterase. And what he does is he recycles. He takes that acetylcholine that was used in here and recycles it back up into the neuron. Take out extra, because when this signal comes down, it floods the space as a neurotransmitter. When it gets down here, it's going to flood the space as a chemical neurotransmitter, acetylcholine. So we have cholinesterase that is going to recycle this acetylcholine and pick up extra. Important concept when we're testing a patient for myasthenia gravis. I'm going to give them some edrophonium, the tensilin test. Okay. It is the acetylcholine that opens the sodium channels at the neuromuscular junction. If you look at that picture, you'll notice that it looks like the end of the neuron is sitting on top of the muscle. It's not. There's a space in between. It's very, very small. Rapid intubation sequence, when you have to, I don't. When you have to create an airway, blocking that neuromuscular junction. Very similar, actually, to the tensilin test using edrophonium. Not surprisingly, we are going to have glycogen near the muscles that is going to give us the fuel our muscles need to be used. We know how that happens. And we know that, of course, in the process, we are going to create heat as a byproduct. Higher demand muscles also have a greater blood supply, which means you're going to get more nutrients, you're going to create more waste products, which is why we end up with two different color meats. Now lactic acid. You're going to end up with two different color meats in the chickens. Rules for naming muscle. The location, biceps brachii, brachii is arm. Number of origins, how many places it starts. Bicep 2, tricep 3. Action, adductor longus, adducts. In other words, it moves apart toward the midline. Remember adduction? It's moving apart toward the midline. Size, gluteus maximus, large. Location, brachioradialis means obviously that it's going to have something to do with the radius. The shape is very obvious example is the deltoid muscle up here on the shoulder. Comes down to a nice point right here. This is where we'd give intramuscular injections into the arm, right into the deltoid muscle. The directions the fibers run, rectus abdominis, the term rectus means straight. Doesn't mean up and down necessarily, but it means straight. And then you could have a combination of things, pectoralis major, chestal shoulder, from the shoulder to the chest. That's the big one. Okay, so looking at some of the muscles of the face, head, a little bit of the neck. Temporalis muscle. The temporalis muscle is one of the three muscles involved in closing the jaw, one of the three major muscles involved in closing the jaw. The temporalis, the masseter, and the medial pterygoid, the three main muscles involved in closing the jaw. Medial pterygoid. Pterygoid spelled with a P, as in Paul, followed by a T, as in Tom. The P is silent. All three of those are innervated by the trigeminal nerve, which is cranial nerve 5.
What's the three that is involved closing the jaw?
Temporalis, masseter, and medial pterygoid, spelled with a T, followed by a T. It's not up there. But I want you to understand that there's three major muscles that close the mouth. Because opening the mouth doesn't require nearly as much. The lateral pterygoid is the one major muscle that opens the mouth. We also have this thin muscle that runs from basically from our chin down to our chest. Have you seen it? It's called the platysma. I thought it was in here. I thought it was in the book, but maybe it's not.
What was the B?
The third,
Pterygoid.
I was going to ask if you mind writing that.
I'm sorry?
I was going to ask if you mind writing that on the board.
Capital P-T-E-R-Y-G-O-I-D. P-T-E-R-Y-G-O-I-D. P as in Paul, T as in Tom, Pterygoid, D-R-Y-G-O-D. All of these are innervated by the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5. Capital C, capital N, and then the Roman numeral B, cranial nerve 5, trigeminal nerve. But we haven't done cranial nerves yet, so you don't need to know that. But it'd be nice to know when you get back to it later on. Perhaps, maybe not, you don't care. The only reason I'm telling you this, the reason I'm telling you that there's three major muscles that close the mouth, one major muscle that opens on. The platysma is this thin muscle that comes down here. It sort of helps in opening the mouth a little bit, but the lateral pterygoid really does most of the work. Why would we need three muscles to close the mouth and one to open it?
More force.
More force, like an alligator. You see the alligator wrestling shows? Once they get the alligator's mouth shut, all they have to do is put a little some tape around it. Because the alligator needs the force to chomp. Not a whole lot to open. Take a bite of an apple. You don't need a whole lot of force to get your mouth around the apple, just open your mouth. But then to chomp it shut, you need more force. So that makes sense, right? So this is, I mean, I'm not going to test you on the pterygoid muscles, but I want you to understand that we're set up similarly. All right, the frontalis muscle, surprisingly found in the front. This is going to raise our eyebrows. Notice this white sheet right here? That is actually a very thin, tendon-like, woven tendon-like material called the aponeuroses. We often find this in areas, flat areas of the body. This allows an anchoring point for muscles. The orbicularis oculi muscles around the eye. These are going to cause you to close your eyes or squint. These have nothing to do with eyeball movement. It's totally different. The extraocular muscles move the eye around, the eyeball around. These are just space. And the reality is, when you look at a muscle, I'll find a good one. The zygomaticus muscle, and then there's a really thin muscle here, a really small one along the jaws of along the nose right here. It's referred to as the Elvis muscle. God, I wish I could remember the name of it right now too. It is the longest named muscle in the body. But it's often referred to as the Elvis muscle because it makes your lip go up. Thank you very much. So if you look at a muscle and you can see where it attaches, and you can see the direction it goes, well, what's going to happen when that shortens? It's going to sort of pull the mouth up, right? The zygomaticus. You can kind of see it with the temporalis. When these muscles shorten, it's going to pull something up, right? And in this case, the jaw, because it attaches way down here on the mandible. You'll see this again with the sternocleidomastoid.
Levator livis.
That's the one.
Superioris.
Yeah.
Aliquis.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
The Elvis muscle. Say it again.
Yeah.
That's going to be on the test.
Yeah.
Spelling does not count. Unless you're just going to write Elvis muscle. We know what you mean. Buccinator. This is the muscle that is going, it's actually going to pull in a little bit more. This muscle is actually going to be a little more active if you're drinking a really thick milkshake through a straw. Helps kind of keep your cheeks close to your teeth. So you're drinking a really thick milkshake through a straw, it's going to do that. Yes. Well, the orbicularis oris muscle is the one that's going to make the kissy face around the lips. Sternocleidomastoid. This tells you in its name that it has two places where it starts. Cleido is the combining form for clavicle. So we have a sternocleido, and then it inserts on the mastoid process. So look at this muscle. It starts down here and here, ends up here. So my right sternocleidomastoid, when it contracts, when it pulls, it's going to pull my head this way. So it's actually going to pull my head back towards center. So if I'm looking to my left, it's really going to help to pull my head back towards center. The trapezius muscles, these are the ones that come up on the neck, and these are going to oh yeah, show your shoulders. That's like 5 minutes of fun right there. What's a trapezius muscle do? All right, 5 minutes of fun for me. You guys want to take a break? Okay, take a break. We'll take a few minutes.